As debates continue over the fate of monuments to the Confederacy nationwide, an article in The Atlantic takes a closer look at how the true nature of the Confederate cause may have been blurred or concealed by what it calls a century and a half of propaganda. Stephanie McCurry wrote that piece titled "The Confederacy Was an Anti-Democratic Centralized State," and she is here to break it all down. She is also the R. Gordon Hoxie Professor of U.S. History at Columbia University. Professor, thank you so much for joining us. Let's start by walking through your explanation of the Confederate Constitution. In what ways did it look to the Union Constitution, and why? I mean, I know it's hard sometimes for when I see segments like this and I read pieces like yours to imagine that people still need to be educated on how and why the Confederacy came about. But clearly we've seen that over the past couple of months, that there are still a lot of people who are ignorant about the Confederacy and what it stood for. So how did all that play into the creation of the Confederacy, which was in direct opposition of a democracy?
Yes, this is a crucial question. And as the statues become the focus of attention, you sort of have to wonder how much people really understand about what the Confederacy was, partly for the reason you just said, which is that white Southerners were so successful in controlling the narrative after the war that they basically rewrote their history. So to talk about the Confederate Constitution is kind of to go to the heart of the matter, because there's this myth that the Confederate Constitution was an exact copy of the original. And that is itself a product of the post-Civil War rewriting of that history. And it was part of the story that the Confederacy was not about slavery at all, but it was about simply trying to restore the Republic to the principles of its original founding. And this is just not true. The Confederate Constitution makes it clear that it was different in crucial ways. And part of this is that even though there were many protections for slavery in the original Constitution, it wasn't good enough for white Southerners by 1860. So what the founders of the United States, some of them were sufficiently ambivalent about slavery that they wouldn't use the term in the Constitution. That term never appears at all. So when the writers of the Confederate Constitution, when they pulled off secession and they finally got their chance to perfect the Constitution, they wrote a really quite different Constitution, crucial in very different ways. And they really took the chance to resolve all the issues about slavery that had plagued the Republic before the war. And so the main thing that they did was they removed all the euphemisms from slavery. So they don't say other persons, they just say slave. And they wrote in direct, explicit protections for the right to hold property in slaves. So they did this in a number of ways. They bound the Congress and the territorial government of the Confederacy. See, they were thinking they were going to expand. They bound them to recognize and protect property of slaves, of every person who owned slaves, and their right to carry them into the territories. But the really crucial clause that they wrote, the really definitive one, is that they wrote a clause that prohibited their new government from ever changing the law of slavery, even in the future. So what they really did, they gave themselves what they wanted, the right to hold people of African descent in the United States as slaves into the indefinite future, potentially into perpetuity. So what we're really seeing here is that the upshot is that when they got the chance, they wrote an explicitly pro-slavery constitution for an explicitly pro-slavery, a new explicitly pro-slavery nation state.
You know, what I like about your article is the question that I kept on asking myself, which was, what sort of America would this be had the Confederate States won? Because I think in the general conversation, there's a focus on the battles, and it's easy to sort of romanticize the battles and the sacrifice, but not on, what the country would have been, what the intention was. And you point out that Jefferson Davis, who, a lot of these Confederate figures have been celebrated, that in fact, he wasn't liked very much at all. These, there were a tremendous number of people in the population that were completely excluded and disenfranchised, not just black people, not just slaves, women, white people who didn't own land, which meant that only a few people were making decisions based on their best interest. So can you talk about some of Jefferson Davis's policies that were directly contrary to the concept of freedom and states' rights and freedom and all that sort of thing that, Confederate supporters now like to point out?
Yeah, no, it's really an amazing thing. I mean, you're 100% correct. Like, nobody would have put up a statue to Jefferson Davis in 1865. He was completely reviled as a tyrant because the government that the War Department became the government. And to wage the war, he basically had to embrace a whole series of policies that were against their own constitution and especially against their own states' rights principles. And some of those policies were a direct consequence of the fact that it was a slaveholding society. So, for example, in that slaveholding society, 40% of adult men are not available for military service. So what does that mean? It means that to wage war against the United States with its bigger population and its industrial base, you have to enlist more white men. And so a year into the war, they had to go to conscription. And in the end, 75 to 85% of adult white men aged 15 to 55 served in the Confederacy. So this was an incredibly unpopular, strong central state kind of move. They had to do similar things with taxation, with the impressment of enslaved laborers against the will of their owners. So there was enormous opposition from state governors, state Supreme Courts, and from ordinary people just to the burden and the onerous sacrifice that was being required of them to wage the war. And these were Jefferson Davis's policies. So he was incredibly unpopular, and the sort of embrace of Jefferson Davis could only come once the Confederacy was defeated, when it wasn't a real country. After emancipation, after his imprisonment, after military occupation, after he wrote his memoirs, it was really in the 1870s that you start seeing any ability, especially of white Southern women, to lionize and revere Jefferson Davis. But you're absolutely right. I mean, the Confederacy as a real government was incredibly repressive. He was called a tyrant. And there's an ongoing debate in American history about who violated more civil liberties, Lincoln or Jefferson Davis.
You know, it's interesting you point that out, Professor. Nowhere that I see that in greater light than my very first visit to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, where I was shocked to meet people who live in the surrounding area who have this very, very favorable view of the Confederacy and of Jefferson Davis, and oftentimes would give and provide opinions that were very much negative when it came to President Lincoln. And I just was astounded by that. And it is surprising to me, as someone who spent a lot of time growing up in Europe, where you don't see vestiges of kings necessarily. They're not respected and lauded in the way that Americans in certain parts of this country revere and respect some of these individuals, when the Confederacy only lasted for 3 years. I don't understand. Maybe you can explain to our audience why we sometimes even see statues in states that were not part of the Confederacy, and how that message has been able to withstand time, because you should remind our viewers that a lot of these statues didn't go up in the years after the Civil War. They went up in the early part of the 20th century.
Yes, the sort of wave of statue building really coincides with the brutal overthrow of biracial democracy in the United States that happened in Reconstruction, especially from 1865 to 77. And that was overthrown by the Klan, by red shirt fascist violence. It was a bloodbath. And when they finally disfranchised Black men, they started to erect this sort of pro-Confederate, mythic Confederate past. And it was part of the rewriting of history and history textbooks. And one of the organizations so you're right. I mean, the wave of statue building is from the 1880s to the 1920s, and then again in the 1950s and the 1960s. So you can see just by the timing what they are statues to white supremacy. They're direct threats to African Americans in time and place, that white people have all the power, and that if they challenge that power, they will be destroyed. And that's why they have to come down. The Confederacy, the flag, the generals, the presidents, the monuments, many of those were put up by an organization called the United Daughters of the Confederacy, which sort of a cultural organization of enormous political power that took responsibility for raising the money to fund these things, including in Arlington Cemetery. They encouraged people to build them all over the United States. if you look at, I mean, most of them are in the southern states, including southern states that never joined the Confederacy, like Kentucky and Missouri. But there are others even in New York and other parts of the United States. And, you know, if you look at the map that the Southern Poverty Law Center or the Equal Justice Initiative put up, you can see the connection between the putting up of those statues and, for example, the wave of lynching of African Americans in the United States. They happen at exactly the same time. So there's a lot of post-Civil War history embedded in the building of those statues and the rewriting of history. And you're quite right about that. As the United States attempted to reunify sort of from the 1880s through to, say, Woodrow Wilson at the turn of the century, or the first decade of the century, there was this writing out of the story of what the war was really about. It became an honor of, you know, an equal competition of equal men in equally honorable causes. And part of this was a way of reunifying the country by purposely forgetting that the war was about slavery, that African Americans had fought for the Union, that they had been a powerful force for turning the war for the Union into a war for emancipation. And so it becomes this sort of nationalization of a mythic Confederacy, not the real Confederacy. And by the 20th century, the Confederacy and the flag and the statues had become a symbol of what they were, for example, in 2010 with the Tea Party, which is they become a symbol of resistance to federal tyranny. So to be able to take that view, you have to say it's not about slavery at all. And that's what happened. Slavery got written out. African-American opposition to all of this got written out. Frederick Douglass wasn't talked about. W.E. Du Bois wasn't talked about. People who had resisted this narrative all along and still do. And the good thing about right now is that this old, you know, the defense of the statues has always, from the people who want to keep them up, as symbols of white supremacy, has always been, it's about heritage, not hate. But the mask is off that now. You know, when you see George Floyd's image projected on a monument to Robert E. Lee in Richmond, it's no longer possible to make the distinction between heritage and hate. Now people see it for what they were, and more white people, Black people have always known this, and more white people are now willing to acknowledge what those statues commemorate, what role they're playing in our polity, in our society. And many more people, Black and white, people of color, all kinds of immigrants, lots of people now understand that we can't go forward like this, that this is not the history of the United States that we want to carry into the future. And we have to take those statues down. That everybody knows what they mean, which is exactly why President Trump is now trying to take a stand on them. But that tells you exactly why they have to come down.
Stephanie, you made just a great point, because my question was going to be, if history is written by the victors, then why has this history been written the way that it is? Clearly, the victors were complicit in this rewriting, but you explained that was an attempt at unifying the country. And so now I want to ask you your personal opinion, having done all this research. Yes, we do know better, and there's a big debate about what to do with these images of the Confederacy. You take them down. What do we do with them? What I'm asking your sort of opinion, even though you're a journalist. Where do they go? What do we do with them? Can we rewrite history?
You know, well, they were rewriting history. That's one of the things. I mean, to say that they're not about slavery is to buy into the rewriting of history. So it's to be willfully ignorant of history, actually. So what do you do with them? Well, one thing is for sure, they cannot be in public space. I mean, I think that's my red line, is that they cannot be in public space, because then they are a threat. They're threats to African-American people. I mean, I grew up in Ireland. There's statues of Cromwell all over the place. Everybody knows why they're there, what they mean. We're not stupid. And protest movements target them because there's a larger set of issues. So they have to come down. They have to be taken down from public space. I also don't believe that African-American citizens, our co-citizens, should have to send their kids to elementary schools named for Robert E. Lee or other Confederates. I don't think they should have to walk into courthouses with statues of Confederate generals in front of the courthouse square. So they all have to come down. And I think there are other things that have to be done. Some things have to go up. I mean, I'm a great admirer of what Brian Stevenson and the Equal Justice Initiative is doing in public history, which their first project was to put up markers of every slave market in Alabama. So to put on the landscape talk about writing history on the landscape. Well, let's acknowledge what that history was. People who oppose taking the statues down, they say, well, that's just destroying history. That's our history. Well, so was the slave trade. So maybe we should put up, that was his view. Maybe we need to commemorate the places where African Americans were lynched. This is brutal, bloody, painful history, but I think they're absolutely right that they have to bring the community together, not just Black people, but the people who are standing in solidarity with them to say our community doesn't support this anymore. So I think you have to put things up, you have to take things down, and you have to engage in a sort of conversation about public history that's intelligent and not allow it to become simply a political ploy. I mean, this is going on all over the world. They're tearing down statues of Cecil Rhodes in England, or the slave trader Colston in Liverpool, the statue of the King Leopold of the Belgian Congo in Antwerp. I mean, these statues come down because people are now more willing to confront the very complicated history. We can't just have the rosy history. And a lot of the controversy over the 1619 Project and the significance of slavery in the United States, this is all being confronted. And while it's a very scary time, to me, it's also an incredibly motivating time because we are having that conversation in a real way.
Stephanie McCurry, your article is excellent. We really want to thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.